Thanksgiving is the latest from horror director Eli Roth, based off of a fake movie trailer he made for Grindhouse back in the day. Written and directed by Roth and co-written by Jeff Rendell, the film is a throwback to 80s slasher movies as Plymouth, Massachusetts is terrorized by a mass killer on Thanksgiving. Good evening. My name's Evan, and welcome to Rocklin Graves. Eli Roth's movies, they're a bit of a blind spot in my horror compendium. I saw Green Inferno years ago, and I love history of horror, but honestly, I don't think I've seen any of his other work. I mean, I've seen a ton of things he's produced, but his writer-director credits have flown past me. There's just so much to watch over the years, but hey, could mean a deep dive is in order. It is weird because even though I haven't seen many of his creations, I love the dude. He's a super knowledgeable horror fan and his passion for the genre is genuinely inspiring. So Thanksgiving, this is a movie that's been on my radar and I've been looking forward to it, but I totally forgot it was coming out until like 3 weeks ago because I live in Canada and Thanksgiving was last month for me, so it was just out of my mind. Lo and behold, Eli Roth climbs from the shadows to extend the festivities. Hey, it was even shot in Toronto and Hamilton, so the stars have aligned for this one. Just before I get into it, I'm getting really close to hitting 2,000 subscribers, and I'm aiming for that milestone by the end of the year, so if you're new and you like what you'd see, I'd really appreciate if you considered sticking around and helping me to grow the channel. Oh, and no spoilers, by the way, you're safe. So this movie's been in development for a long time. All the way back in 2010 was the first time that Roth said that he was turning this fake trailer into a feature film, but Eli's a busy dude and things kept getting moved around and pushed back, so it took 13 years from that first announcement for the movie to actually get released. That's a long time for fans to start building up hype, so does the movie deliver? Yeah, it's great. I had a blast with this movie, pretty much the whole way through. I'm not sure what's shown in the trailers because I haven't actually seen any of the marketing, but from the opening scene that I really hope the trailers didn't spoil, I knew I was in for a really good time, and for the most part, the movie held that up. I'm sure this is being called a love letter to old school slashers, which is something that we hear so often these days about movies that don't feel like they get what makes slashers fun to watch. A lot of modern slasher movies will have a cast of really annoying characters written by someone who has no idea how young people talk, and a mass killer who pretty much just kills people by stabbing them. Throw in some gimmick to try and set yourself apart and wipe your hands and call it a day. Thanksgiving isn't concerned with trying to reinvent the wheel or do some new twist on the genre. It's just a straight up great slasher movie that was clearly made by someone who gets it. Good old slasher movie comfort food in the best way possible, but what do I actually mean when I say that this feels like a more genuine love letter to the genre? For one, it has to do with the characters. This is thankfully becoming less true, but there was a long stretch of time where slashers started taking themselves way too seriously and tried telling these gritty and dramatic stories with their characters to pad out the runtime between kills, but it was often the most bland melodrama that sucked all the fun out of the experience. Compare the characters in the original My Bloody Valentine to the remake, and I think you'll get a pretty good idea of what I mean. There are a handful of characters here, of course, that are just, the obvious ones just there to be killed off, and it's not like there's any massive standout characters that will go down in slasher history, but the cast is just a lot more fun to be around than, that bland melodrama that I was talking about. It actually got to the point where there were some kills that bummed me out a bit, because in that central cast, there aren't really any that I found irritating. I liked pretty much all of them, and that gave some good weight once things pop off. Even some of the characters that you start off thinking are just going to be bland archetypes that are nothing more than fodder, end up getting more dimension than you might expect. Again, that's not true for everyone, but it doesn't have to be. It was just a nice surprise to see a little more heart injected into the town. Charm. To me, it's one of the most important elements, and it's something that Eli Roth nailed with this movie. It's charming. Small town where people eat at diners and the cops mess around. The characters we follow go out to little fairs to win prizes, stuff like that. it makes a huge difference for me, and it added a lot to the experience. It actually reminded me a fair bit of My Bloody Valentine, even having a love triangle with a pretty similar setup to it. This movie's got a bunch of nods to fellow films from the genre, some more obvious than others, but in my opinion, not a single egregious one where it felt like the movie was relying on the existence of another to hold it up. It felt like Roth genuinely paying homage to movies that he loves, but always putting his own spin on it or having it be nothing more than a subtle tilt of the hat. That's the sort of thing a lot of these kinds of movies get lost in these days, and I was consistently impressed with how well that element was handled. All that's great. That's awesome that it's got the small town charm and the characters were fun to be around, but that's worth fuck all if the villain in your slasher movie is lame. But you can rest easy knowing that Thanksgiving is one of the most entertaining killers I've seen in a while. Even though I haven't seen most of Eli Roth's movies, I am well aware that they tend to be not tame, so I was expecting going in that there would be some brutal kills, and yeah, I was absolutely right about that, but they're not just reliant on the gore holding up the scene. What made it really work was just how creative the death scenes are in this movie. There really wasn't a single disappointment there, and the way that Roth's dark sense of humor is mixed in with the kills was just great. There weren't many people in the theater, but most of the deaths got a good chuckle out of the 8 or so of us that were there, save for 1 or 2 that I think were meant to be a little more, of an oh shit moment, and those also landed, I think, exactly as intended. It was just so much fun watching these sequences play out and really not knowing what to expect. There were little things that would get a close-up and you immediately go, okay, well, I know that's gonna come into play, but where the surprise comes from is in how they were used. A lot of the movie's creativity and humor is on full display in these scenes, and it's not all practical effects. There were some very clear uses of CGI that weren't anything that took away too much from the scene, and the effects themselves were so cool that it didn't end up bothering me much. Not to say there aren't any practical effects though, don't worry about that, because there are plenty and they're fantastic. It's a pretty gory movie, but it's more so the creativity of the death sequences that made it effective. And thankfully, it seems like these last few years of asymmetrical horror games are teaching people to be a little smarter than usual when it comes to avoiding a slasher killer, because there are some pretty damn resourceful characters here. There was one scene in particular where there was a character who was trying to escape from the killer and avoid getting caught. It was such a great sequence that was full of tension and decision-making that actually makes sense. It went on for a while and it was great, and it also makes you have more respect for someone who you start out thinking is just going to be a stereotype. It's easily one of the best scenes in the movie. The absolute best way I can describe this is slasher movie comfort candy. I love the charm, the characters were entertaining and mostly handled themselves well, the killer is awesome and very creative, the humor blends into every element incredibly well, but if I'm gonna bring up one gripe with Thanksgiving, it's gonna be how it concludes. The climax itself was really fun and felt pretty satisfying, which is why I'm not saying it's the ending that bothers me, but it's the last few minutes that left me feeling a little meh. It seems like they weren't quite sure how to properly conclude the story and tried too hard to sequel bait after a climax that makes setting up a continuation feel really forced. And the final scene is super tacked on. That didn't work for me, but it's not anything that took away from how much fun the overall package is. Plus, maybe that's just part of this. A lot of those slasher movies that we love from the 80s also don't have the greatest endings, so sometimes it's a little hard to tell if they were trying to pay homage to that or if it is just genuinely not a good ending. There aren't a whole lot of Thanksgiving horror movies. There's the Thanks-killing movies, and you have Blood Rage. I'm sure there are more, but those are the only ones that really come to mind for me, and honestly, this is probably my favorite one. It reminded me a lot of My Bloody Valentine, which is one of my favorite slasher movies. Thanksgiving is just a damn good time, and if you enjoy slashers, this one is sure to give you that comfort candy that's been sorely missing for a long time. It doesn't do anything particularly new, but it's got a great charm and it's a hell of a lot of fun and has one of the best opening scenes to a horror movie this year. It was so good. Also, I didn't know that Tim Dillon was in this movie, so that was a nice surprise. I'll be curious to see how this performs at the box office, because it does seem like there's some interest in continuing with a sequel if it does well enough, and I'd be all for it. I've only got one more video to go until the Christmas season begins, and I've got all Christmas-themed videos coming in December, which I'm really looking forward to sharing with you. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.